All right, well, thank you, everybody, for your patience. So the last group was the Pioneer Valley Arts and Cultural Center, who presented who are not here, and they talked to Mr. Wayne, did they call you?
Actually, the message from me, so I didn't talk to him.
Okay, so they did not withdraw, they just weren't able to be here tonight. So we heard from Smith. Do people want to walk through each one, or how do you want to handle this? Does that make sense? People want to have a quick...
What are we being asked to do?
Well, let me tell you what...
That's what I was
Okay,
question.
all
What
right,
are
where we
asked
are,
to do?
that's a good point, good point. It's a long day.
What's our authority, in other words?
Well,
Much, what?
not a lot.
Please.
Just advice.
Advice. I mean, the Commissioner of DCPO has the final authority on making a decision here. I think we have an advice role. Joan Honig is here from DCPO, busy taking notes to take back to the Commissioner. And Tom Robinson in the back has been hired by DCPO to do marketing of the site. So they'll take our advice. But I think that they're concerned that whoever ends up here has the support of the Northampton community in order to make it successful. So I think they're interested in our advice. I don't think that they're going to shut us down on that. So do we want to walk through these individually? Do we want to talk sort of more conceptually? How do people want to handle that?
My suggestion is talk conceptually first.
Conceptually
sort of some
first.
general issues to talk about, and sort of think about where we are in this process.
One question. Has ECPO accepted these people as viable bidders, all of them?
The question is, has DCPO accepted all of the bidders as viable? What DCPO did was not rule anyone out, as opposed to saying that people were viable. I think that that's more accurate, that nobody was screened out. So you heard from everyone that put a proposal in.
Oh, okay. This is, I thought maybe there'd been some preliminary screening.
No, there was no preliminary screening. This is it. Northampton State Hospital raw.
I guess I'm overall disappointed.
Well, I mean, we can talk about that, and that's the kind of the big picture conceptual discussion, I think.
Can I just, before we do specifics, one general comment is, you sort of got the very quick version. We all went to Boston and heard what you've heard in 3 hours and 2 days, and I mean, everybody had to take a lot of compromises to narrow it down. And I mean, I think that you certainly had a sense of what's out there, but here, imagine everything you heard and be a lot more optimistic and get more excited about it, and that was what we heard in Boston.
Without concluding people should be more optimistic, at least we heard a lot more detail.
Mhm.
And we had a lot more time to probe and get people's take on things. But nevertheless, what, if we could start off by saying what were you hoping to hear that you did?
Something a little more firm.
Something more firm.
Yes.
Okay.
To build on that, I guess I was expecting more fleshed out. There were an awful lot of unanswered questions. I have a feeling these were just the embryonic forms of the proposals. And I'll have to admit that I thought that there would be something much more complete, much more definitive than what we heard tonight.
I think to defend the people who proposed, although I was also disappointed in a lack of detail, I think to expect them to invest a lot of money in marketing studies and do a lot of that work before they've been named developer, I think would be difficult.
But it's sort of on a trust me basis, isn't it? Now?
A little too much, yeah.
Well, I think there's a...
I mean, you gotta say, does this outfit look like it's gonna carry through?
That's a
Have they
good
got the resources? Have they got the...
point, well taken.
And I don't have anywhere near enough data to decide that.
I think what albeit I probably was as frustrated as anyone else with the lack of detail in some of the presentations and the vagueness. But I appreciate the shortness of time that they had to do the presentations, and I appreciate the fact that a couple of the campus-wide developers did not have their designers who did their main people who did the presentations in Boston with them today. I think that what I was hoping to come away from this meeting with is more of a sense of the vision that we have been discussing for the last 3+ years and more of the vision that the planning board had when they wrote the plan unit development, and more of the vision that the legislature had when they wrote the law. And that is what we want to see this main piece of developable property in Northampton end up as. And I didn't get any inspired vision from campus-wide developers who came tonight. I didn't get anyone who said, this is an important piece to an already successful small New England city. We know that, we recognize that, we can feel that, we can taste it. We don't know how we're gonna do it, but we're gonna do it with you. I didn't get that feeling from anyone tonight, and maybe because the key people, the designers, weren't here, the people who have the vision, I don't know. And you know, maybe those people weren't here to represent that vision, but that was missing more than the dollars and cents issues, and more than some of the detail that we're gonna eventually need to hear, or want to hear.
Mr. Fogel.
I think Danny hit it right on the head, except that it wasn't there to be had. I mean, no matter who presented it, no matter what time, I mean, I think we do all understand what we think Northampton has to offer. I think we do all understand, with the time we spent here, what this space, what this area offers to the community, what it presents as an opportunity to take Northampton and not just make it bigger, but make it better. And none of them came in, I mean, they all acknowledged that the RFP was, which I take some, as a group, some pride in, is that the RFP created a challenge. Well, that was what we designed it to do in terms of coming up with something. And yet, none of them, in my opinion, have provided a response that's acceptable. That the DCPO has no basis with which to accept any one of these and to run forward and away from us on it, in my humble opinion. And so, maintaining the floor, I would say that somehow,
Kick you up.
thank you, until we get to a place that we can say that, okay, it's gonna cost X amount of dollars to get this remediated, okay, you know, you've gotta put some money into it to get to a show-me place. You know, I've always taken the position, notwithstanding the statute, that it's gotta go through us as a blessing or as a denial. And nobody's come up with what on page 20, I think it was 25 or 26 or 24 and 25 of the RFP, they haven't provided any of those details. And so for them to go ahead and accept any one of them at this point would be inappropriate and unfair to any of the others. And until we get to some specifics about what it is gonna cost, until they can tell me where they're gonna get their financing and what's gonna happen in year 6 or year 7, that, to me, we don't have anything that we can work forward with.
But is Julie correct in saying that she can understand why why no one has invested the kind of money that it would take to bring this further along? Or was the process too short? Was there too short a time span for a developer to come up with the vision?
And isn't there another factor possibly too? What about the marketing plan and the marketing procedure? What was communicated to the potential developers? In other words, that's the question I have. Perhaps I was expecting more than what, in that regard, than perhaps the marketing procedure conveyed.
There's a couple, that's a fair question, the timeline's a fair question. I think,
Wait, can I say something?
can I finish what I was gonna say? And then you can say something. I also think we had discussions, I can remember a number of discussions where some folks at this table who shall remain nameless thought we might not get any valid responses to the first RFP.
And he's right.
And he might be right. I mean, because we knew this was a very difficult project. So, go ahead.
One of the things that's kind of hard for us to deal with right now is that we didn't actually go through a master planning process, which would have finished some of those studies and gotten into more of the studies, which would have had that. I mean, that was sort of the state's responsibility to do that master planning work, and we were sure we should have had DCPO cost that stuff out. I think what DCPO's position had been at various stages through this was that there was a market, we were gonna get a demand, this was gonna be such a hot property, that a developer would come forward with substantial background and have the means to invest and do that work, and so they wouldn't have to, and then as much of the cash associated with the legislation would be available for project activities. I think what you found out, though, was that the people who came forward were responding more to the community nature and sort of the vision that was in the RFP, but then they didn't want to put the money on the table because it just wasn't appropriate for them to do that. And so we're sitting here now and we're asking the developer to jump in and do a quickie master plan. And I feel kind of bad about that because that's a big cash investment for somebody to take that step. And to know that they still may not be able to bridge the gap, you know, it's like, I don't even think there's enough possibility of them to successfully, you know, find the answers even in a master planning, that it's a tough thing to ask somebody to go and do that, when essentially maybe that's the question that we should be considering. Should we do that, or, you know, get that done and then see if we can do some, you know, conversations with these people?
Did
I mean,
any of,
that's sort of what I felt about when you were talking to me.
in any of the longer presentations, did any of these groups have any money that they were willing to bring to this, or was everybody looking at
You know what?
State and city?
state and city?
No, I don't know.
Who was at the longer presentation? I know.
The three of us, four of us,
Three-
Carrie was there.
And of course,
Tom.
DCP.
Now,
obviously, yeah.
but
Okay.
actually, no, I think that they were, various of them were certainly willing to bring private capital to the table, but I also think there is an expectation that there's gonna be some expenditure of public dollars.
We're
think
talking
that's-
remediation now, we're just talking,
I think remediation, and also, we have set out some social goals. If, for instance, if there's to be affordable housing, your assumption is they're gonna have to go find money to help
but I
pay for
think
that
that's
cost.
true of any marketplace,
and
whether it's.
There's some
land or-
infrastructure costs that they believe, that some of them believe that need to be covered by, as public costs, not necessarily from DCPO, but maybe through some kind of state or federal grant that goes for infrastructure, for instance.
But I agree, I mean, that's the lesson that I've, Mary's
Right.
lesson of, we learned something very valuable here, in that the land is not as valuable to at least the first round of proposers as we thought it was. Or at least as the state thought it was, because maybe the state was naive in thinking that they wouldn't have to spend $5, $10, $15, $20 million on remediation to get somebody to come forth, somebody else to put up the money at that point and say, we're gonna spend $250,000 on a master plan for this property because the state's putting up $15 million for remediation. You know, quid pro quo, whatever, I don't know, some kind of, let's make a deal. And there's, right now, it looks like that we're asking the developers to make all the deals, and the DCPO or the state's has not come forward with their part of the deal, other than with the balance of $5 million that the legislation has guaranteed. And we don't even know what the balance of that is.
Wayne?
Several developers, when they talked to us, I think one of them used the term tonight, saw this as not being a project so much of they being a buyer of this property and developing it, but saw their role as being the owner's agent and the owner being DCPO. So they were seeing it as if you hire any other consultant. They want to represent DCPO, taking them through the transactions, taking them through the pre-development and the development phase, with DCPO still being responsible for remediation,
That's the impression I got too.
for demolition, and also DCPO holding title, which reduces carrying costs until demolition and clean site. And at that point, then you have a clean site. It's comparable with the private market is. It may be we're still going to be looking for grants for infrastructure, but it's probably not going to be from DCPO. That would be the same thing we look for when we develop a business park or industrial park, other competitive grant.
But is that a sentiment that is at all reflected in DCPO? I mean, in the department itself, is it, would the department, could I ask this question?
Well, I think his facts are accurate. I just don't know that we would necessarily come to the same conclusion on the remediation and et cetera, that we would then having them act as our agent. I think the perception is that we're still looking for somebody to be an acquirer of this project.
Right. But
This may be just a semantic distinction, however.
I think, right, but I'm saying would the state be willing to defer payment until remediation was done, however it was agreed upon? I think
I
that's
don't think
what.
we're at that stage yet, that we've made that kind of decision.
I think the other piece is that we talked about is some of these developers have to bring it to the next stage, and the next stage is really looking at the economics of the deal, and that hasn't been done. And the economics of the deal really comes back to the demolition and taking care of this site to get it ready to set the infrastructure into it. And I think maybe you can address that, Clea, because we talked about it, bringing it to the next
One conversation we did have, after we had initially heard from folks presenting, is I think that we were, well, let me back up. We did have the benefit of 2 full days at DCPO listening to people present. I'm not sure that what a benefit that was, because it's striking to me that everybody's gotten to the exact same question after 20-minute presentations as we did after 2 full days. So, but I want to, but
A lot more detail.
right. But what I think did happen,
And you had lunch.
and we had lunch.
Oh, sure.
That's true, and beverages.
And brownies.
I don't care about beverages. Give me food.
So,
Oh, brownies?
but what we did talk about were a couple things. One is that
I show them a good
there,
time.
clearly, we need more information from folks about how they see this sort of happening over time. So what do they see as sort of a phase 1? What do they see as a phase 2? What do they see as a phase 3? Without going to a full master plan, sort of how do they see that playing out? And how do they see the economics of that playing out? Sort of a pro forma on those phases. And,
How are they gonna get that when we don't have our piece of the data that they
and I think that what we talked about was DCPO getting a lot more serious about what the numbers are on their side of the table as well. That was the other part of that discussion.
Which really has to be done over the next 3 or 4 weeks.
And we're asking for those
And
numbers
that's that
quickly.
remediation. And I, you know, I have a great understanding for some of these people in their discussions, because I can probably come up with a figure, a square foot value figure of demolishing the buildings. I've done a lot of it throughout the country. I'm really not in the marketing end. I'm a developer for 25 years with major companies. But I can't put my finger on the asbestos, the lead paint. I understand what they're talking about. I think that is something that, as a developer, I'm in the process right now of working on the Boston Garden. That's a demolition project of great extent. Again, once it's down, it's going to be a great piece of property to develop, but it takes a lot to really to work this through. I've been on it for 2.5 years, and I look at this project here, and it's not as extensive, but again, I say to myself, you really have to take the step now over the next month to bring back to you people exactly what it's going to cost to get this down to the ground, and then go forward with your roads, your utilities, et cetera, And I think during this period of time, I think I could work with the Commonwealth in establishing a figure, which you all have been looking at tonight. What is it? To get into that point. We did this, I advised and helped the Commonwealth on the Boston State Hospital, which was a 167-acre parcel in Mattapan, and it worked fine. It took us 6 or 7 months to get through the remediation and what we had to take down, the buildings and the tunnels, et cetera, I just found myself in listening to these developers, they just came to a point and they said, look, here's what we'd like to do, but we just can't take the responsibility of the piece of property. And I think over the next 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, we've just got to get that number to find out what the Commonwealth has to do or what they can do. And basically, it's taken, and then come back to a developer and say, you know, you've got to run a set of figures on what you want to do on this piece of property. And if you want to phase the piece of property, you can phase it and do it over a 10-year period, because a lot of them are coming back and saying, look, we just don't want the carrying cost of this here. We can run some internal rates of return on this project, and we can do some apartments, and we can do some commercial, but we just don't want to carry all this load of interest-bearing property. Maybe we'll do one phase, let the Commonwealth hang in there for a couple of years, and we'll come back to them. And after we complete one phase, and the city is happy with it, the Commonwealth is happy, we'll go to the next phase. And these are all different ideas that we talked about over a 2-day period. So I think the way we ended was to amongst yourselves, you will look at these various developers and maybe go back to 2 or 3 of them, etc. And we would have to spend some time with them in Boston to have them perfect what they have started out to give you today. And then
Well, but
you'll have a much better idea of what money they can bring to the table and what they can accomplish on the piece of property.
But concurrently, DCPO needs to, and I think this is what we were also pushing, is needs to get a lot more real about what kind of money DCPO thinks is necessary to do the
That's right.
remediation
That's right.
involved, and what kind of money can they bring to the
That's
table.
right, but again, what we talked about was that if you take one piece of the property, and I just give you an example, you take one piece of the property on the smaller campus, the Memorial campus, and if you were to develop that, it really depends upon what the Commonwealth is gonna put on that piece of property as far as the land cost. And that's a big, big number. If they decide to, whatever the pricing of that piece of property, if they say, hey, we will clean the piece of property off and then we want to charge you a market price or half market price, et cetera, then a developer can do his numbers. And that's what we're trying to get right now. And I think that's what you said, Claire, it's a combination of the Commonwealth coming up with some numbers that they can live with, to give to the developer so he can put together some performance and say, look, I can go to a life company and I can get X amount of money for takeout, I can get my construction loan, and here are the numbers, and here's what I plan to do. And they just couldn't come to that conclusion.
Why don't you go ahead?
Would the process you described exclude other developers who chose not to come forward because of some of the limitations at this point?
This is not this is probably a question for the Commonwealth to answer. In other words, can someone else come in now to the process?
They can't.
Well, my concern is that a lot of very good developers said, we don't want to take the risk for all the reasons you described.
Yeah.
So if your suggestion to Mary Claire is, now let's go back to this group that we met with tonight and let them come forward, I think you're missing an opportunity with some better qualified developers who wisely excluded themselves from the initial phase.
Can I speak
Mr.
to
Fogel,
that?
is this on this
I-
question?
Absolutely.
And then.
I think what we're losing sight of is that to focus on the remediation cost as being the sole deterrent is that if there was a theme that came through, while the responses were encouraging, if there's a theme that came through, it was that as attractive as Northampton is, I think one of the presenters said, you know, it's been a limited growth. It's been a relatively flat, the quality of life has been nice, but it hasn't been this bubble, and perhaps nor have we wanted it to be. But a lot of what I felt you could read into the presenters is they wanted to phase the purchase. You know, they weren't willing to come in, plunk down a whole lot of money, however you value the carrying costs, because they didn't have that much confidence in carrying it out to 10 years in terms of the profitability. So in terms of what Charlie just spoke to, again, while it's been encouraging, I think that to market this property, and the analogy I drew in my own mind was to a person with a septic system trying to sell their home, they've got to go out and do a Title V in order so that any buyer knows what they're getting. You know, we haven't done, if you will, the Title V, DCPO hasn't done the Title V for this property. And so it seems to me that we have to evaluate what the remediation costs are going to be. We have to put a value on the infrastructure. Then we should also ask these first round of presenters, and I'll call them that instead of responders, how to get what more information they might need in the course of collecting that data to present a complying response, and then put out a second RFP so that the people that Charlie's speaking to, I mean, these are the steps that I think have to happen in order for us to take this gem and mine it properly.
I think,
Dan, and then Mayor?
I think but there is one conflict that has to be resolved on the part of each developer, and that is, if you don't have a vision, no matter what the remediation costs are, you don't know whether you're going to preserve and reuse buildings or you're going to knock them down. But if you have the vision, if you really truly believe and this is what it's going to look like and this is what it's going to be like, even if you want to do it parcel by parcel and to limit your carrying costs and your liability, if you have that vision, then the remediation of different parcels of land becomes less essential. You know what I mean? If you're going to knock down the main complex and you're going to literally level 400,000 square feet of building because it's not part of your master plan, then you know that from the get-go. But if you start playing around and say, well, if the remediation cost was this much, and then maybe I would save part of the building, as one of the Woodstock associates said, maybe I'll say part of the building because I like that part. You can't do that and ever get to a real number. You can't. No matter whether the state comes up with a real number or not, if you don't have the vision of what you're gonna do with the property, you can never get to a real number.
See,
And what he has to do, go back to Woodstock, what he has to do, and I spent some time out here with him, just going through the property as I did each one of them, he should have brought that, I mean, if he could have, brought that to a conclusion. Here's what it's gonna cost me to demolish the pieces then in between the 4 structures that I wanna keep.
Correct.
Then what I got now is I got 4 structures that I have to rehab. What I'm gonna do, I can give you a figure now, it's gonna be probably $65,
That's
$70
all I
a
was
foot.
at, that's all I wanted to
Then when I
hear.
get to this point, and here's what I really think you have to understand, or bear with me a little bit, because of the public entity that's involved. Then I can take those numbers, because I have my structure. I know what I'm gonna put in for tenant improvements, improvements to this here, to get it ready for apartments, or whatever I'm gonna use this for. Now I can draw a performer. I can do this all in a 3 or 4 hour period. It isn't a big deal. We have programs that we do them for a project up to, you know, I can do a project of $300 million, a hotel, some condominiums, and some retail. And then, and if you follow this through, let's just take this memorial, just stay with this, as a developer. And then I say, okay, my returns are gonna be X amount, I can go out and borrow these dollars, and I really don't want, at this period, the Commonwealth to do anything except sell me the land for $2 a foot. Okay? This will make it economically feasible. And now I can go to the other side of the street, okay? And I can figure out that the gentlemen that want to do the laundry and the other building down there, there's X amount of dollars that are gonna need. So what's happening here is the developer is playing some numbers against what the Commonwealth is gonna pay. I'm kind of stymied sometimes in this deal over the past 2 or 3 weeks, because I keep saying, as I told the mayor and I told Wayne, what I'd like to see over the next 3 weeks are the chosen developers who you would like to see, one more time, put together some numbers, so therefore they're saying, hey, this is all I can do. These are the numbers that make sense for some apartments, a commercial entity, et cetera, et cetera. And Mr. Commonwealth, you have got to put in X dollars. And here's my proof. No one brought it to that particular situation.
But they'd have to
And
understand what the market
a lot of
conditions
people
were.
that were here, and I have to say, Joan and I came out on a couple occasions, and I think the proposals were far advanced, because we spent time with each one of them. I spent time with the whole 8 of them. And I sat, Mary Jane was nice enough to set up conference rooms up here, and I spent 2 or 3 hours, and I says, look, if I was answering this proposal, here's what I'd do. I'd go back and rethink a few things, but no one rethought it to that end. And I think if you give them a chance to bring it to that end, then the Commonwealth has to make a decision of what they want to do as far as the cost of this piece of property.
Right, but
Running parallel
Right,
with
but
that, then at that particular point in time, you can either accept someone or start over.
Well, that's, I mean, there's 2 questions actually on the table, though, and I think that you brought up a legitimate question. If the Commonwealth changes position relative to the amount of resources, then there's a question there that needs to be dealt with in terms of this RFP. And I think that was where you raised your hand, Mayor, to address that question. Am I right about that?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay. So could we?
I guess
And then you.
although, yeah, I want to hear from the folks on the other side. Just a couple things to keep in mind. The city, the planning department, City Hall, the local CAC, I think the Chamber of Commerce and the Planning Board have been pretty clear now for several years that we had hoped for the Commonwealth to help the due diligence along further by doing more engineering studies, more environmental studies, and so on, so that we would be firmer in both sides, the Commonwealth and the developers. So I think we've made that clear. But given that that didn't happen, it is the Commonwealth and their disposition process, not ours, and we're just advisory. And understanding, as I fully well do, that there were other folks that I think had the capacity to do a good project up there who decided not to bid for a number of reasons. And one of them being that they couldn't figure out how to firm up the figures on demolition or that kind of thing with the material they'd been given. And so understanding that, I guess I'm not so sure that we're not making appropriate progress now in an appropriate process with the people who did file. And I think that's pretty important to look at. In other words, I think that by having actual developers speak to DCPO staff people, there are a number of people there from different levels last week, it carried the process further than all the many months of us municipal volunteers and staff making some similar requests. I think by bringing people to the table, even though it didn't, Tom's describing he would have liked to see it go a little further, but I think it did move the process forward. So you can't say, well, maybe I shouldn't say you can't. I guess the question is, when is it legitimate to say throw out this group and look for a new group of bidders because somehow we collectively, the Commonwealth, has changed our strategy. It's not the same, knowing that there were other good bidders out there maybe who shied away doesn't mean the ones that came in aren't qualified. So I just, that would be a caveat on my part. Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to see 18 months ago another $250,000 spent by the Commonwealth, and then when this RFP went out, we would have had everything from, a stronger marketing thrust about, we know there's Class A office space that's filling up in Springfield, and we should put some of that in, and we need more 3-bedroom units for housing, and we could have put all that stuff in along with engineering and demolition and environmental costs. But we didn't, so it's a question of what do we do now?
It strikes me that all these points are well taken, and what, if I may, Tom has given us is a clear seller's perspective. Now, I've got something that everybody should have wanted, and I want you to put as much money into helping me finance whatever this group of information is, rather than me having to finance it. And so that, to me, is what we seem to have found out, is that we've gotten some interested people who haven't been willing to fund the information gathering because the whole marketability of the project isn't wonderful. It's great, but it's not wonderful. And so what it seems to me is the ball's really back in your court, and that you as the seller need to provide that information, and then by providing that information, to leave out any of those who might have been interested at the first stage becomes inappropriate to our grand vision of what happens up there. And so I really think that it becomes critical to go out and value that information, provide it to the marketplace, and say that we will fund it. Or at least know what it is, so even if you can say it's 65 a foot or 95 a foot, these people clearly weren't willing to buy the time that the Commonwealth is buying in your time or whatever other resources they have, because they weren't sure where it was going to end up. They didn't know what their budget was going to be, and this wasn't so profitable that they were willing to take that risk. And I think that that's it in a nutshell, and we really do need the state and DCPO to put some money up to evaluate that Title V equivalent or whatever you want to call it and say, we know if you raise the whole campus, it's going to be X dollars a foot. Now, play with that information, and if we can use whatever resources we have, find out what the financing is that's available to do it, and somehow we'll allow it at a phase if we only have to put up X dollars or whatever we might be able to do, because we all want to achieve the best possible purpose, which is going to be a great development for the benefit of this community, employment opportunities for the state, and as much money coming into the state to keep down the costs that they're going to face in trying to market this property.
Exactly. And just a point, doing a waterfront project in Boston, and I think about this many times as an analogy. I really want to buy the pad on the waterfront with the slurry walls in place, so I don't have to worry about tides, I don't have to worry about, now I put my pad in there, I start my horizontal, vertical structure, and I go up with the building. I look at this here, and I say, in talking with each one of the developers, and just follow that last point, I think you hit it right in the button, as far as trying to work somewhere halfway with the Commonwealth. Because in talking with them, if I look at the Memorial Campus, and as I brought that piece through this weekend and did some numbers on it, I believe that I could go in as a developer and take that parcel and make it work financially. And now, without any help, and now you've got this $5 million here. I can borrow sufficient money to start that piece going. So therefore, if I was going to try to run numbers on the whole campus, I would say, look at Commonwealth, you get $5 million, and maybe you can start working on a demolition piece over here on the main campus. If the land is priced correctly after you get the main campus down, I have now satisfied myself that I can make the Memorial campus work and basically work some numbers out over a 6-7 year period to show my returns and what I'm gonna do. And that hasn't been done. And as I told the mayor and as I told Claire, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I would hope that these people, with the guidance of myself and Joan, a couple people at the Commonwealth, can reestablish the numbers, not reestablish, really set some numbers up, and then come up with exactly what they need from the Commonwealth, and work the developer to the Commonwealth, and come up with a plan 6 weeks from now.
Right, but I guess, I mean, may I?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. But I guess my question
And
to
then I
you
want
would
to do a
be.
time check.
Okay, my question to you would be, if you were, you have been a developer,
Yep.
and you're not gonna commit X amount of dollars to go out to this particular project until you have a known factor that that slurry wall, as you use the example, is gonna be paid for.
Yeah.
Now, what you're saying is you might have, well, there are a couple of expressions, but with the television here, I'll just say the larger shoes, to go forward with that than maybe some of these people were, either because you have bigger bank accounts or better supporters or whatever the case may be. But if this is what we were able to entice or attract in this first round, we need to build a slurry wall, I think, rather than trying to negotiate over who's gonna pay for how much of it. That's the distinction that
And I
I'm
think
making.
that's what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So if you get the
I-
state to do
I
that.
think, I see Tex has his hand up, and then let's, do a time
Well, I mean,
check.
do you agree that?
Well, let me hear what you have to
Yeah.
say.
It seems to me, I keep hearing that the state is going to have to put more money into it. Is there a reading from somebody who might know some better than some of the rest of us? I see you're shaking your head.
I know where that's going, I don't think so.
Is there a reading in terms of the possibility of more money?
That comes after the pro formas get evaluated by DCPO. That's my sense of when they'll go have the political conversation. So that's 2 or 3 steps, I think, down the road.
Which I would like to have the ability to sit down 5 weeks from now or 6 weeks from now and feel confident that I could sit down with the Commonwealth and say, here's the cost. Here's what we have to do.
I think,
Now, this isn't saying that I've got 674,000 square feet, which I calculated, okay? I went in there and I said, I wanna save 2 walls, I wanna save some vaulted ceilings, which are absolutely spectacular. And if people who have been in Boston, I took people I envision, partners of mine have done 101 Arch Street, which they saved the wall, and State and Congress, which is they saved the stock exchange, and just shored up a wall and built right behind it. So you can take pieces of that building, that main building, and you can keep them for prosperity going forward and build right behind them. And I looked at it and says, it's gonna cost me somewhere in the vicinity of $4.25 to $4.75 for demolition. But the thing that I don't have is that figure for the lead paint and the asbestos, because I'm not too sure walking through where the asbestos is. I know some can be encapsulated down below the ground, but also you got tiles in there that have asbestos in them, et cetera, et cetera. So I would like to get a handle on that
so,
with the developers over the next 6 or 7 weeks. And I think something's gonna come together where we'll
Could I-
have that number to talk about, a
could
very
we,
finite
could we
number.
just do a snapshot here, and then I know that you have something you want to say here, but,
That can wait.
okay, let me just try a snapshot here. What we know is that the Commonwealth has about $4,300,000 that's available for this project, right? That's the balance, we think?
Yep.
4.3, 4.4, something like that?
Yep.
Okay, that's what's available. And what else is available is the phasing of the project so that the carrying costs can be played with over time.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 numbers that can be played with. And that's,
And they got the price of the land.
And, excuse me, thank you.
Very important.
Those are the three variables.
Very important.
Price of the land, $4.3 to $4.4 million, and the phasing of the project over some period of time.
Right.
And what we had some preliminary discussions about was having at least some of these folks who wanted to be campus developers look at those three variables and run some pro formas based on juggling those three variables. That's what we had talked about. And that then we get to see what the size of the whole is. And what we asked as a part of that was that DCPO try to get much more specific about the costs of the remediation, because otherwise you can't find that hole.
Right. And
So
have-
that's
and could-
sort of where, in order to get to that next step, then we'll know whether or not any of these are viable. We need to sort of play with all those numbers, I think, is what we were trying
And
to
have the
say.
developer tell you what they can do for you. Have the developer tell where they can go with a piece of property and where it just becomes uneconomical to do anything.
Well, that's-
And that's where I have to pick up at that particular
That,
point.
and that's where we're looking in terms of specifics, taking those variables. So then I saw your hand and then Dan. So,
Being ever the optimist, I'd like to toss something out for consideration, and it may help everyone. I've never met Bruce Volz or Tony Clark, but at looking at their thing, I see they live in Florence, and that encourages me. Here are two guys who want to bring jobs to Northampton. They want to bring it to a very small piece of this parcel, probably some of the most unattractive structure on the whole complex. And they have a great use for it. And I wonder if there's advantage to DCPO to work with these two guys and to see if, in looking at what needs to be done with asbestos, with demolition on that one piece, you might have a stepping stone to go forward with for your other developers. And we can say, look, we got some jobs started up there.
Well, I have a problem with that.
Dan was next, and then we'll,
Two points that I would like to make. One is, I in some ways concur with what Charlie said in that we seem to be just talking, because of the emphasis on campus-wide developers, we seem to be just talking about campus-wide developers when we have a parcel developer or two that has made proposals, including Smith College, and we should acknowledge at least our opinions of those parcel
yeah.
developers and how we feel about doing it on the quick start basis or doing it, reacting to their proposals. I think they both deserve a reaction, an individual reaction tonight from the CAC. I don't think we can just stop this conversation at whatever time frame we have and say, this is what we're gonna do, we're gonna find out the cost of remediation, we're gonna send the information to the campus-wide developers, and we'll have them back another time. So I think we have to do that. The second point, if I may, is we put it out for proposals. We've got 8 proposals. I think we deal with those 8 proposals until some finalization, and then if we don't like it, we send it back out. I do not think we re-invite people at this point. I do not think that's fair. If you didn't want to jump in the water because you thought it was too cold or too deep the first time around, shame on you. You missed the first time around. And if you come back, if we put it out again, and you want to jump in the water because it's less deep, and you know it, or you know it's not as deep because the DCPO has told you how deep it is, then you get a chance to come in. But if you didn't come in the first time around, I don't think we're done with the process yet for these first proposals.
So I heard two votes in favor of early swimmers or something. And,
Whatever, yeah.
the other,
I was stretching for
Right.
an analogy.
right. The other thing that I heard was a request that calm yourself down there. I'll get there. I
That's
wish
not-
I
the
had
snack's
like
not
a,
holding.
wish I had a super soaker at some of
Just for me, right?
Just for you, sir. The other thing I heard was that we have actually 3 individual parcel developers that have made proposals that we may want to have a quick reaction to, and or maybe not so quick. We had Smith College, Volz Clark, and we had Beacon Companies that made
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
proposals
apologize.
on individual parcels. And the only caveat around individual parcels that I'd like to put out there is that if one sells an individual parcel ahead of time, the money that goes to the Commonwealth goes to the general fund. There's no way to earmark it back into the campus. That's a dilemma for us, I think. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily a dilemma for the Commonwealth. I don't think anybody really cares in the Commonwealth. But I think it's a dilemma for us if we're assuming that we want it to fund itself in a sense, so that we may take positions on individual parcels, but then want to look at them in the context of the overall development in order to keep the flow. So that's just a point.
I think that, just to react to that, because I initiated the point about individual parcels, I think they're so individual that I think they either impact a campus-wide developer's proposal or don't.
Well,
I think they're very cut and dry.
Let me point out why I think this is important, Dan. In terms of the Hospital Hill proposal, which I believe Smith College is willing to pay for.
Handsomely, I believe.
Handsomely. That money, in my mind, should come back into the state hospital development.
I understand.
And if we were to say right now to Smith College, sure, go ahead, we agree with you, go ahead and do it, that money would go to the general fund and probably be spent on the central artery. You know, so, that's why I think it's important for us to think about, and the same for any other proposal now that, I mean, if we separate them out, I think we can do this relatively, I think you kind of said it when you said there were two. I'm not sure that there's a general sentiment here that we want to peel out A and H from the rest of the campus. Am I correct in that?
It's the
think
heart
that's
of
Way
the
too
campus.
big.
Way too big.
It's way too big. It's the heart of the campus.
If I could say so, what it does is it would, if we're thinking of this phasing idea, you could see some strength and weakness of that connected to what Beacon was talking about. We know that the easiest thing to fund probably is housing development. You know who to go to for investors for market rate housing, and you know which government programs to help you get subsidized housing. So in fact, even though that's the whole central heart of the campus, if they or somebody like them got that part and started on housing, it could almost be phase one, just like Tom is saying parcel B could be phase one. And I kind of raised that to flip it and look at both ways. I don't want the whole central part of the campus removed from jobs development yet.
I think that's the fundamental
That takes
question.
me back to the process piece of the campus development, which we didn't hear a lot of emphasis on tonight. When we spoke to a couple of these people last week, they spent a lot more time talking about the specifics of how they go through a process to figure out what to put where and what the community wants and needs and so on, and what's marketable. And so if we assume now, for instance, that parcel B can go quicker, so let's get started on that as phase one. And you have to make a decision right away whether that's gonna be like an office park or an apartment complex. You are precluding options, just like you are if you gave the whole central part to Beacon.
But the proposal on the table from Beacon is A and H. Is there a consensus here about the idea of pulling that out? Doesn't mean that Beacon doesn't get forwarded onto a master developer and they couldn't consult with them on anything that they want to consult with them about. But in terms of us taking a position on that, do we have a position on taking A and H out?
Would you like a motion, Mary Claire?
I would like something.
I propose that we not accept Beacon's proposal.
Are we not
Second.
recommend?
I recommend. I second
By way of discussion?
Yeah.
I think they rank way up high in terms of capability as a developer, which is not to be ignored. It's the fact of them wanting all of that,
That's
That's the
Without
problem.
which is the problem.
I think that's exactly what we're voting.
I don't think we ever approached them with, could you settle for less? Would
Right,
you
I think
settle
what we're
for
saying is
They
that
must
we,
have impressed you much more when you heard them
I
longer.
think the
Yeah, really.
problem
Didn't
with Beacon
impress
is
me much.
at the moment, it's just
Was you
premature.
impressed with us?
And they've talked to me, and I think it's premature. They're very qualified, they're great competitors in the city, but all of a sudden you're taking the plum of the developer who you're gonna pick, and you're pulling it right out of his development package. Where, again, I go back to the parcel, the memorial parcel. I, as a developer, could see going in there tomorrow and working with these gentlemen here in the back piece. I could see it not affecting the
So-
infrastructure whatsoever, and then taking the main
Let's-
piece and getting that under construction over a period of 1 year.
But if we're sticking with this very question that's on the table, go ahead.
Yeah, I got two big problems. Number one, I don't agree with Dan that we have any swimmers yet. We got a bunch of people who brought their bathing suits, but nobody's gone in the pool and to just.
Oh my God, we're gonna get soaked with
No,
this
no, and to
metaphor, I can
give,
tell.
well, you were the one who raised the squirt gun. But I don't think we have any swimmers yet, and to give them any fair advantage merely because they've put some stuff together, they haven't done anything with numbers, they haven't told me what
Who
they're
are you
gonna do.
speaking about?
To do any of these parcel
Right. We have
developers,
a-
I think that.
I'm
let me
gonna
finish,
rule you out of
please.
order because we have a motion on the floor.
Right, I want
Are
to
you
speak to
speaking
that.
to that motion?
I was getting to it.
Good, let's
I'm
get
saying that I think that to give away the gateway, it's not the backside, as Tom just said. If the Earl
Okay.
Street, Route 6, Route 10 connection's gonna be the gateway, while it may be a laudable development, and I think it's great, and it's maybe part of the process, to take little pieces out, whether it's the plum, or the pit, or the peach, or whatever, doesn't really give the master developer, whoever's got, I mean, some of these came with very nice visions, that gateway becomes important, and whether their vision of that gateway is gonna be beautiful, or acceptable,
We
or,
actually agree with you, Bruce.
I agree.
so then I don't think we can say we recommend any one piece yet. We really need to see a master development first if we wanna get the most out of this project,
But-
so.
Key. That's key.
Right,
I agree.
and what we, I think
You
what,
convinced me.
Let's move the question.
the question
Move the
is,
question.
Right.
do we accept a proposal, do we recommend a proposal that pulls that out of the heart?
No.
Okay, that's the question on the
Yeah.
floor. Who votes in favor of not
You've already had
recommending?
moved the question, you can't debate this.
Well, we've got a
anymore.
motion.
Right, I'm summarizing the motion, the question's been moved.
You're asking for the
All
nay
in
vote.
favor of not recommending the Beacon proposal?
At this
Just the
point.
Well, no, that
Beacon
wasn't,
That was
Yes,
the motion
that's
on
the
the
motion.
floor,
Oh.
Just the Beacon.
which is what I was desperately trying to get you to speak to.
And yes vote is to not.
So now we're gonna deal with all
A
three.
yes
It's
vote is
negative
to
vote.
not recommend,
That's right.
that, to cut the heart out, as you
Okay.
said.
Not gonna cut the heart out.
right.
Okay,
Right, do you wanna talk about the pit now?
is that
As long as
passed?
I got to
Yes,
use the
that
plus.
passed. Okay, what's it?
And I'm surprised you didn't remember when I asked them specifically the question about the infrastructure piece. And I said, did you have enough money to cover the cost of the infrastructure? And they said, no, they wanted to work with the master developer.
Right.
And so the one thing we gotta be real careful here is that all of these people are anticipating working with a master developer
Right.
who's gonna be the key negotiator in the state. They've got to balance those infrastructure costs, you know, anybody.
I don't think
even-
anybody's disagreeing with you, Mary
You
Jane.
know, and the other thing was the cash flow piece. I mean, that's what the master developer is gonna use to cover those.
I think everybody's agreeing with you. I think that what we're saying is that we don't see that as a standalone proposal for A&H. And I think the second part of that is that that Beacon proposal gets forwarded to the master, whoever is the ultimate master developer, and they can negotiate with them as they see fit. And now the second question, but nobody liked it as it stood, which was, it sounded like housing only in the heart of the campus. People didn't like that proposal.
Yeah.
Okay. Second proposal that came up was, I'm gonna start at the top, which was Smith College Hospital Hill only.
I move that we not recommend that proposal.
At this
Second.
time.
At this time.
At this time.
We're not turning them down, we're just saying
We're
deferring
saying we
the
want to
action.
keep the money here.
So we want to forward that to the master developer as well. But people, unlike the other one, like this proposal.
I think you have to
Yes.
record that differently.
Right.
Yes.
Before you vote on this,
Yeah.
there's a few options to think about. One is, it might be that you put this in abeyance, but if a master developer is chosen, and that master developer says, oh yeah, this fits with my scheme, and if there's some way to get that money to roll over, not to go to the general coffers of the Commonwealth, then under those big ifs, then you might want to go ahead with this.
It's RFP too. That's,
Well, can I make a suggestion that the motion be that we recommend that Smith College obtain parcel K through the master development process?
I'll accept that as a friendly amendment.
I'll withdraw my second.
Okay.
And with the
Claire,
proceeds
Claire,
going
it
to
would be
promote
nice
the rest of the
If
development.
you just got a consensus
Yeah.
on the Smith deal,
Well,
that you felt comfortable with it, because as a developer, and talking to many developers over the years I've been
I don't think
involved,
anybody's
they-
worried about the
they'll-
developer, Tom.
they'll
I think
want
everybody's
anything.
worried about the
Any
state of
developer
Massachusetts.
will wanna tie up anything they can. I think the Smith deal is wonderful. for the
I-
community.
I think there's consensus around the Smith deal being wonderful for the community. I don't think that's the dispute.
Okay.
I don't think we want the state of Massachusetts to take the Smith check. I think that's the
So we're
dispute.
just, you're just talking the money part.
But-
We want it to further
I-
the development.
I've gotta say right now, Claire, the kind of money that they're talking about compared to the kind of money that the remediation's gonna cost the state.
Kind of money
is- I'm just saying right now, if we, at this juncture, issue any kind of sentiment that we're hesitant about the Smith deal for whatever reason, because it goes in the general coffers of the state, I think is inappropriate. I think we're so in favor of Smith owning that property that any hesitation at this point is totally inappropriate.
Interesting.
Cliff.
Yeah, Karen.
I would at least like to say that I consider still
I give them
unresolved
the lease and
the
then
social
purchase
benefit
or-
for the mentally ill in terms of education and job opportunities that Smith could potentially provide. I understand they've offered a substantial amount of cash, but the purpose of the disposition of the land was to have clear benefit for people with mental illness. And that has to somehow be built into, I think, at least my support for
Yeah.
the
Good
Yeah.
point there.
And the point being there that if, and my guess where I'm coming from on is if the money stays with the project, it goes into the ultimate benefit of the mentally ill. If it goes to the Commonwealth, we don't know that benefit exists. I
Right.
understand what you're saying, Dan,
But one potential way to do that is to ask Smith to offer that same amount of money in trust for clients of DMH. Because one of the things that we understood in Boston is the actual process is probably, given all these master developers who are saying they don't want to take title to the property, if that's the scenario, it may actually be difficult if you go through a master developer to sell to Smith anytime in the next 2 years before the master developer actually takes title. So if there's a way to structure it so that the Commonwealth sells the land directly to Smith, but there's some way to ensure those funds go back to clients or eligible clients, I mean, and we don't know if it's possible. so-
You know, I don't think we should be taking votes on these things. There are too many ifs. I think we should record
I
the
think that's a
pluses
good
and the
point.
minuses,
Yeah.
the concerns that we have by consensus. Because that's one
Yeah.
option.
Fair enough.
Another option is they may think of some fancy way that a developer 9 months from now could take certain parcels and then roll them over. And the money would come back and help them with their carrying costs or some, you know, that might also be feasible.
I don't
So-
have a problem with us not taking votes.
Yeah.
I'm getting worried that we're gonna start losing
I think
people. And there's
we
one
should
more.
record
I
the
think people
concerns.
have recorded their pluses and minuses on the Smith piece. And then the last one to record pluses and minuses in terms of a sub piece is the Bolts-Clark proposal for the laundry and the physical, and the power plant. And that,
I think it's subject to the same considerations.
Yeah,
as this one.
basically the same considerations.
it's gotta
Yeah.
have your master developer in place first.
And afraid and the fear of losing the assets to the state.
I want to throw another couple things in.
I just look at my only comment on it, and I talked to both Bruce and Tony. I just think that you just take a little subsection of that parcel right there, and the laundry building is fine, and let's find out, which I will, the remediation process of that building. And then the power building is just a quick study on, should that be taken out of there? Is it more feasible to take that out of there and let these gentlemen have that piece of land for their expansion?
But the
Or is it gonna cost the Commonwealth more to rip the boilers
Yeah,
out, et cetera?
I think,
And that,
I think that certainly the Commonwealth has to figure out those numbers. I think there's a couple other issues, though. And these are the ones where I think people are saying that has to be part of a master development, but maybe the DCPO could figure out whether or not there's a way to lease up ahead of time to one person who wants to come in, and can they do the work on it? Because to subdivide that out is a lot of work for that little piece of property. So maybe there's some work that DCPO could do to figure out with any of these parcels, if we want, that your quick start question.
I have evolved to liking the quick start, okay?
Okay.
I went from being afraid of it to, it wasn't that cold and it wasn't that deep. And I am wearing my bathing suit underneath.
And so to figure out how to
Matches your
do
gloves,
it.
right?
I want to see life on this
Put your
campus.
wetsuit
on.
I want to see people driving to work here, parking their cars, getting out of their cars, and going into work. I want to see that.
Could I say this other stuff I want to see, if that's going to be our light industry section, I think that a master developer should be encouraged to look at adding another 1 or 2 buildings, or either on the downhill side from the laundry or the uphill side of the power plant, and and that the state or the developer might negotiate
So-
separately the power plant
I-
from the laundry, because I'd like the development of the laundry to get, it seems more feasible to start it quicker. It seems like the most immediate need of this business, and we don't want them having to move to Chicopee because they can't fit over in East Hampton anymore.
So-
But I think we should be looking at that whole strip there.
So I see people packing up papers, and I want to try to get some,
Direction.
well, it sounds like we have some directions on the subs. It sounds like there's some Smith piece people like, but want to figure out how to do it in a way that protects that asset for the community and for the benefit of the mentally ill. And secondly, this other one that people want to see if that can't get it going quickly without losing it, and as a part of a master development. It seems like that people want to get some more figures, right? People want some more clarity around the balance of numbers between remediation, phasing, and the cost of the land, to see how that plays in together.
And a more complete and professional proposal.
That's
To bring
right.
it to a conclusion.
That's right. We want, from the
For
developers.
both the developer and the Commonwealth.
So I guess what I'm gonna suggest to folks is that you heard proposals from seven people. There was one group that was unable to attend. You heard from 4 people that were interested in being master developer. Community Builders, Sustainable Development, Woodstock Associates, and Wilson Briggs University. And you should call the mayor or me as a CAC member to weigh in with your thoughts about this, because there is no voting on this. We are merely advisory with your thoughts on who you see as people that we should be exploring further with. I don't want to do this in a public forum, Bruce.
Oh, no, I don't have any problem with
I don't want to do a vote on that.
No, I don't have any problem with the
And I think-
non-vote,
and I
Madam Chair,
think we-
but I do have a problem with just limiting it to advisory, because I think at this point, if you read
Well-
the legislation, if there was any effort on the part of the DCPO to try to accept any one of these proposals, it would be wrong
Well, that may be.
and actionable.
That may be the case, and we're gonna have to have further discussions with DCPO about that, but I think you should probably, you and I should have a further conversation about the legal questions there, because I've read that pretty
Oh, no,
carefully.
don't confuse me with facts, my mind's made up.
Shouldn't they have brought
I have a
at
six-
least the financial responsibility?
People,
about-
what's that?
Shouldn't they at
But
least
that re-
at
I
least
think
brought
that
Do you have a
that
problem?
presupposes that there's
Responsibility
an
of everybody
RFP
came
response, a
forward
proposal
to
that meets
state.
any of the requirements.
What's that?
You read page
Shouldn't
25 and 26, haven't
DCPO
met
have
any of them.
brought the
There's
financial
nothing to
responsibility of
negotiate.
each one of these people? Are they capable of carrying through this project?
The thing that we didn't do in this public meeting was lay out dollars that the developers brought to the table, because that didn't seem
No,
to be
I mean-
appropriate.
DCPO knows some of these people well, and we don't.
Right.
They should have an opinion and say, we think A, C, and D can really do the job.
Well, based on what you've seen tonight, I
The
would
rest of
like,
them, we should throw out.
you should call in about what you think should be thrown out, and I don't think it's gonna be that different.
Could we talk about what
We have given, I understand my
is the
opinion.
message to the 8 proposals?
To be
What are we
given
gonna,
a shot before
what's the
you all.
DCPO gonna send them as a letter?
They're gonna, they are very specific legally.
We'll see. We'll go on the way.
No, no, what I'm saying
Are
is,
we adjourned?
when are they gonna contact?
I guess so.
I think in the next